say to the honourable gentleman, give me this, I will not tolerate such behaviour. If you want to go out now, but if you stand again, I'll order you out. Make your mind up. Either shut up and get out.
The unthinkable just shattered the heart of Westminster. In a moment that will be remembered for decades, the Speaker of the House of Commons rose, defying every expectation, and made a declaration that sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom. Nigel Farage, the man long dismissed as a political outsider, has officially been declared the next Prime Minister. The air in Parliament turned electric, charged with disbelief, awe and fear. Keir Starmer, once the unshakable pillar of Labour, froze completely, colour drained from his face, trembling under the weight of a moment no strategist could have predicted. The old order, built on decades of careful manoeuvring, rehearsed speeches and polished facades, collapsed in an instant. The streets of London erupted in whispers and speculation. Social media exploded with real-time reactions. And the entire nation watched in stunned silence as the impossible became undeniable reality. This was not a political manoeuvre or a calculated step behind closed doors. This was a seismic upheaval, a violent rewrite of the rules of power, and a display of authority so raw, so precise, that it left even the most seasoned politicians gasping. Farage didn't storm into the chamber with bluster or theatrics. He moved with a quiet yet piercing intensity, every step measured, every glance carrying the weight of inevitability. Members of Parliament from both sides straightened instinctively, sensing the shift in energy as if the very walls themselves knew history was about to be made. When the Speaker spoke, the room fell into stunned silence, each word like a hammer breaking centuries of tradition and protocol. Starmer attempted to respond, but his carefully constructed composure crumbled, every calculated response falling flat, every word hollow. Farage's presence alone commanded attention, and as his voice cut through the tension, every accusation landed with precision. Broken promises, economic mismanagement, the betrayal of ordinary citizens, and the complete failure of leadership that had long allowed complacency to fester unchecked. Even the Conservative benches were not spared. The Tories, accustomed to projecting control, found themselves opposed, their ambitions mocked, their authority questioned. The laughter that erupted was not of joy, but jagged, nervous, reflecting the growing panic that the political landscape they had long relied upon was slipping from their grasp. Every pause, every sentence from Farage carried the weight of inevitability. It wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning, a stripping away of illusion, and a brutal reminder that power was no longer a promise of privilege. It was something to be earned, to be seized, and Farage had just claimed it in full view of a nation that had watched, riveted as the old order crumbled. Starmer, once celebrated as the disciplined architect of Labour's revival, now sat slumped, his mind racing, trapped in disbelief. His aides whispered frantic reassurances, their words powerless against the tidal wave of authority and precision that had just swept through the chamber. Every carefully crafted strategy, every rehearsed line, every political calculus had been dismantled in minutes by a man who had long been dismissed as irrelevant. MPs from both parties struggled to comprehend the scope of the upheaval. Eyes darted nervously, conversations fell silent, and even those with decades of parliamentary experience admitted privately that they had never witnessed anything like it. Farage's attack was surgical, methodical, and devastatingly effective. He didn't simply critique policies, he dismantled reputations, exposing every weakness, every failure, and every hypocrisy of the political class that had for years operated with the assumption of immunity. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, sat frozen, the words cutting deeper than any critique she had faced before. The Labour shadow cabinet reeled, their panic almost tangible, a tableau of power stripped bare. The Speaker's declaration was the final, unmistakable confirmation the old political order was dead. Farage had not only seized control of Parliament's attention, he had seized the nation's authority, reshaping the rules of engagement, redefining who held power and signalling a future that no one could predict. Outside Westminster, citizens were glued to their screens, absorbing the collapse of a leader, the humiliation of a party, and the rise of a man who refused to be ignored. The British public, long cynical and disillusioned, felt shock, disbelief, and in some corners, elation. Farage had spoken directly to their frustrations, their anger, and their hopes, translating decades of silent resentment into a visible, undeniable force. Parliament itself seemed diminished under the weight of the moment. The gilded halls transformed into the stage of a political revolution. Farage didn't need to gloat, to raise his voice, or to threaten. Silence became his instrument, amplifying every accusation, magnifying every failure of the old order, leaving only the undeniable truth. The era of predictable politics was over and a new chapter had begun, one written in bold strokes of conviction, audacity and fearlessness. For the first time in modern memory, the British people did not need analysis or pundit interpretation. They understood instinctively. Starmer's authority was gone, the Labour Party's credibility in tatters, and Farage had proven that one determined individual could overturn decades of political convention, commanding the stage and the nation with unrelenting mastery. This was not chaos for spectacle. This was a deliberate, unstoppable display of power, leaving every politician, every voter, and every observer with a single, undeniable truth. Nigel Farage was now at the helm, and Britain would never be the same. The aftermath of the Speaker's declaration rippled through Westminster like a shockwave, leaving chaos in its wake. MPs who had long considered themselves untouchable now sat frozen, unsure whether to speak, move, or even breathe. Every eye was drawn to Nigel Farage, whose calm, measured demeanour contrasted sharply with the panic around him. He did not celebrate, he did not raise his voice. Each word he had spoken still lingered in the air, a meticulous demolition of authority that had left both Labour and Conservative parties scrambling to maintain control. Starmer, once the picture of composure, seemed almost invisible now, slumped in his seat, face pale and eyes wide in disbelief. His aides hovered like shadows, whispering frantic instructions and reassurances, but the words fell flat, incapable of patching the gaping hole in authority that had just been carved before the nation's eyes. The Speaker's declaration was more than a formal announcement. It was a punctuation mark on decades of political stagnation, a signal that the rules had changed forever. Farage's rise was not merely a personal triumph, it was a public reckoning, an exposure of every weakness, every failing, and every hypocrisy that had allowed the old order to dominate for so long. Every policy failure, every broken promise, every instance of political theatre was laid bare. Labour, once confident in their resurgence under Starmer, now seemed directionless, their strategy evaporating in real time. Members who had prepared for debate, for negotiation, for careful political manoeuvring found themselves powerless, scrambling to respond to a force that had already moved beyond conventional tactics. The Conservatives, no less shocked, were caught unprepared. Their rehearsed lines of defence, their predictable gestures of reassurance all collapsed under the weight of Farage's precision. Laughter occasionally erupted in the chamber. Jagged and nervous, the sound of politicians realising the foundations beneath their authority had shifted, perhaps irreversibly. It was not chaos for its own sake. It was chaos born from the dismantling of certainty, the exposure of fragility, and the undeniable proof that the political game could be rewritten by those bold enough to seize opportunity. Outside Parliament, the British public was witnessing history unfold in real time. Screens across homes, cafes and offices lit up with images of MPs frozen in disbelief, Farage standing unshaken, and Starmer's visible collapse. Social media exploded with clips, hashtags and live reactions, trending almost instantly as millions tried to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Ordinary citizens, long accustomed to feeling excluded from political power, now felt a part of something monumental. Farage had not only claimed leadership, he had claimed their attention, their imagination and their collective energy. Conversations erupted everywhere, from living rooms to office desks to public transport, as people debated, speculated and reacted to a moment that seemed almost cinematic in its impact. Analysts scrambled, pundits pontificated, but even the most experienced commentators struggled to contextualise a disruption of this scale. The collapse of authority, the dismantling of credibility, and the audacity of Farage's rise defied decades of political convention. Within Parliament, the tension was palpable. Whispers replaced speeches, nervous glances replaced confident stances, and even seasoned MPs found themselves reconsidering every assumption they had made about the durability of political authority. Every gesture, every expression, every pause became magnified, as if the chamber itself had become a pressure cooker of expectation, fear and awe. Farage had mastered timing with near-perfect precision, allowing moments of silence to stretch, amplifying the weight of every accusation he had made. The old political rituals, the careful language, the rehearsed deflections, the polite deference to protocol were meaningless now. What mattered was authority, presence, and the ability to seize narrative in an instant. Starmer's aides attempted damage control, hurriedly drafting statements, coordinating whispers behind closed doors, but it was already too late. The perception of competence, of control, of leadership had been shattered irrevocably. The Labour front bench had become a tableau of panic. Hands clenched on desks, eyes darting for guidance, whispered conversations tumbling into frantic murmurs. The Conservatives, meanwhile, were similarly unsettled, caught between disbelief and the dawning realisation that a man they had long dismissed as irrelevant now dominated the political landscape. Outside, the media frenzy escalated into a national storm. News outlets broadcast Farage's calm authority and Starmer's visible collapse repeatedly, framing the moment as a historic recalibration of power in the UK. Clips circulated instantly on social media, going viral as ordinary citizens replayed Farage's piercing critiques, Starmer's trembling responses and the stunned silence of MPs. The hashtags trended not just in Britain, but globally, as the implications of the upheaval rippled across borders. Political commentators scrambled to interpret the ramifications for domestic and international policy, for trade negotiations, for alliances that had long been taken for granted. But even their analysis could not fully capture the magnitude of what had just happened. Farage had not simply won an argument or a vote. He had redefined power itself. He had shown that authority could be claimed through presence, conviction, and the unflinching willingness to confront complacency. The British public, witnessing the unravelling of the Labour Party, the exposure of Conservative fragility, and the audacious declaration of Farage as Prime Minister, was electrified. Long-standing frustrations, simmering resentments, and the sense of being unheard were suddenly given voice through a single individual. Communities across the country, from coastal towns to red wall constituencies, felt represented, understood, and validated for the first time in years. Farage had not just seized power, he had ignited a national awakening, reminding citizens that politics was not an abstract game played by distant elites, but a force that could be challenged, reshaped and reclaimed. Meanwhile, within the gilded halls of Westminster, the reality of the situation continued to unfold with crushing clarity. Starmer, his image of calm and control obliterated, sat in stunned silence, his mind racing and body frozen under the weight of humiliation that was immediate, public and inescapable. His inner circle, previously confident in their leader's authority, grappled with panic, debating desperately what steps could salvage credibility, what statements could contain the damage. But the moment had already passed them by. Farage had seized initiative, controlled narrative, and turned every whisper, every glance, every hesitation in the chamber into evidence of the old order's collapse. Silence became his weapon, presence became his message, and every observer, from MPs to journalists to ordinary citizens, was left with a single, undeniable truth. Nigel Farage had changed everything, and the rules of British politics, long considered immutable, had been rewritten before their eyes. The frenzy did not stop within the walls of Parliament. It spilled outward, engulfing the nation in real time. Across the United Kingdom, citizens were glued to their screens, replaying Farage's piercing denouncements and Starmer's collapse, unable to look away from a spectacle that felt both historic and surreal. Coffee shops, offices, buses and homes buzzed with conversations, debates and incredulous laughter. Social media erupted in a storm of clips, reactions and hashtags, trending globally within minutes. Every citizen, whether politically active or disillusioned, felt the tremors of change, the undeniable shift in power that had been executed with surgical precision. Farage had not only captured authority in Parliament, he had captured the imagination of the people, translating years of frustration, betrayal and hope into a single, powerful force. For communities long ignored, for voters who had seen promises crumble year after year, Farage's declaration was validation, a seismic confirmation that one individual, audacious and unrelenting, could overturn the carefully maintained illusions of the old order. Westminster itself seemed transformed. Its gilded halls no longer the home of untouchable power, but the stage of a dramatic overthrow. Every gesture, every whisper, every nervous glance of MPs became magnified, amplified by the awareness that the old rules no longer applied. Farage's calm authority, measured words and unshakable presence made the chamber itself feel smaller, reduced to a crucible where decades of political convention were burned away in a single afternoon. Starmer's aides scrambled desperately, their attempts at messaging and reassurance collapsing under the sheer force of Farage's narrative. Every statement, every strategic pause, every carefully rehearsed rebuttal that Starmer might have relied upon now seemed meaningless, swallowed by the overwhelming momentum of a man who had seized control, not through manipulation or backroom deals, but through unflinching presence and decisive action. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, remained frozen, a symbol of a party in freefall. Her every attempt to regain composure was thwarted by the unrelenting authority of Farage, whose words had dismantled the credibility of both Labour and Conservative benches with equal precision. The Tories, long accustomed to a facade of control, now sat exposed, their influence eroded by the audacity and clarity of a man they had dismissed for years. Farage's rise was a masterclass in power, a demonstration that authority was not inherited, manufactured, or preserved through tradition, but seized and commanded in the moment with conviction and fearlessness. Beyond Westminster, the media landscape erupted in a frenzy unlike anything the UK had witnessed in decades. Newsrooms flooded with footage of the Commons, of Farage's calm authority and of Starmer's public disintegration. Journalists scrambled to capture every nuance, every inflection, every moment of tension. Headlines screamed of Farage's triumph and Starmer humiliated, while social media exploded with live reactions, memes and commentary. Ordinary citizens watching from every corner of the country felt themselves part of a moment that transcended politics. Farage had become the vessel of collective frustration, a symbol of defiance, and the embodiment of the possibility that the political system could be challenged, reshaped, and ultimately reclaimed. Conversations erupted everywhere, from pubs to boardrooms, as people tried to process the collapse of a leader and the simultaneous rise of a man who had long been considered an outsider. Analysts and pundits attempted to interpret the implications, but the spectacle itself defied conventional analysis. The narrative had already been seized, and Farage was firmly in control. International observers could not ignore the unfolding chaos. Diplomats, foreign ministers, and global media turned their attention to the United Kingdom, broadcasting Farage's audacious rise and Starmer's collapse as an extraordinary recalibration of political power. Trade partners, allies, and rivals watched closely, recognising that the UK had entered a new era. One defined not by tradition or protocol, but by audacity, precision, and the boldness of individuals willing to rewrite the rules. The ripple effects extended beyond borders, with global markets, political analysts, and foreign governments all adjusting to a reality they had not anticipated. A man dismissed as irrelevant had, in hours, upended the status quo, exposing fragility, incompetence, and vulnerability in institutions once considered unassailable. Within Britain, the impact on public perception was immediate and visceral. Citizens who had long felt politically powerless suddenly felt represented, seen and heard. Farage's words had captured the frustrations of ordinary people, the stagnation, the broken promises, the economic uncertainty, and the sense of abandonment by politicians who had long treated their authority as unchallengeable. This was more than a political victory. It was a symbolic reclamation of voice and power, and the nation reacted accordingly. The collapse of Labour and the exposure of Conservative weakness created a vacuum in leadership, and Farage stepped into it with deliberate clarity. Every step, every gesture, every word reinforced his dominance, making it impossible for anyone to challenge his newfound authority. In the aftermath, Parliament itself seemed smaller, diminished under the sheer weight of the moment. The gilded halls, once symbols of enduring tradition, had become the site of a political reckoning, where centuries of assumed privilege and untouchable authority were stripped away in a matter of hours. Farage's rise demonstrated that power was not guaranteed by office, tradition or party loyalty, but could be claimed, executed and magnified by those with vision, audacity and the courage to act decisively. Starmer, meanwhile, remained a picture of defeat. Reports described him sitting motionless, staring at documents that no longer mattered, trapped in the realisation that every carefully curated image, every rehearsed speech, every promise to voters had been dismantled with devastating precision. His inner circle, once confident in their ability to maintain control, now scrambled desperately, trying to stabilise a narrative that had already been irreversibly overtaken by the reality of Farage's authority. Efforts to salvage credibility were futile. The political order, long protected by the illusion of stability and hierarchy, had been exposed as fragile, vulnerable, and ultimately dependent on the will of those bold enough to seize control. By evening, the scope of the upheaval had reached every corner of the United Kingdom. Citizens across cities, towns, and rural areas debated, celebrated, and grappled with disbelief as the reality sank in. Nigel Farage was no longer an outsider. He had seized power, rewritten expectations, and demonstrated in real time the fragility of authority and the audacity required to command it. Parliament, the media, and the public had all witnessed a moment that would redefine British politics, leaving no doubt that the old order had been shattered and that a new era, dominated by conviction, audacity, and unflinching leadership, had begun. Farage's mastery of presence, timing, and authority had created a spectacle that was thrilling, terrifying, and unforgettable, a moment where history itself seemed to bend, and where the nation realised that the rules of politics were no longer what they had been.